try to take seriously in my book the Republic of Vietnam, this second Vietnam which was defeated. But it's not because you're defeated that your history has to be erased. So it was very important to me, again, to work in both in the far back history with the Nguyen and the others in the Red River, Vietnam, but also to write the history of both of these Vietnams in the late 20th century, or during the second half of the 20th century. This isn't an anti-national argument on my part. But my argument here is that if we get beyond the idea that there is only one Vietnam, I am trying to say that it can render Vietnam's past less exceptional, less simplified, and a lot more interesting. I'm also trying to say that there's nothing exceptional about it at all. Look at the history of Germany. Germany is not some sort of anciently constituted nation state. It's born in the 19th century. If you look at the left, you have Prussia, not yet the Germany that Bismarck's going to put together. If you look below here, this is Germany at the end of World War II. I didn't give you a Germany during the Third Reich. It was even bigger than the one up there, of course. Then you have two Germanys here. Two Germanys which existed until 1991. And then, of course, you have the Germany that we know today. But Germany is a recent construction as much as Vietnam is a recent construction. Germany's past is no more unified deep into the past than Vietnam's is. There was no full boot for Italy until the 19th century. This is something that could definitely get me in trouble in China, but even China is perhaps not what it seems to be today. China is a construction. If you look here, this is Qing China, the provinces. The Qing came to power in 1644. They were ruled by non-Han, non-Chinese people who are going to colonize western parts of China. Tibet was a protectorate first established in 1751. Again, here's the Han Empire. Here's more or less the China that you know today, given to us by the Qing dynasty between 1644 and 1911. My point is that China, as well, is a construction. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't help myself. I grew up on a farm south of Kansas City, on the Kansas side, not far from Missouri, bleeding Kansas. The marauders coming over from different sides. I learned all the stories when I was a child. My point here is that the United States is a construction. There's nothing surprising about that. The United States was also a divided country, just like Vietnam was in the past. Vietnam had its share of civil wars. We had a great civil war in the United States, as you well know. I give you these examples just to show you what I'm trying to do in the book by way of comparison. I'm using comparisons like these, the Indian Ocean, Germany, Italy, the United States, as a way to kind of de-exceptionalize, to show that we don't have to turn Vietnam into some sort of a special thing, because if we do turn it into some sort of a special thing, I fear that we lose that complexity and that fascinating story that I'd like to try, and I hope, and you'll tell me, that I try to bring out in my book. Let me turn to my second theme. It's the theme of modern Vietnam. I was asked to write a history of modern Vietnam, and yet I went way back to the 3rd century BC. My editor let me get away with it. And I gave him the argument which I'm going to try to give to you now. It's the problem of 1858. It's the problem of the French colonial moment. The Paul Dumer Bridge, if you go to Hanoi, you can still see it, or parts of it. It's a sign of the modernity which the French brought to Vietnam, to the Vietnamese people. This map, you can't see it so well, it's kind of an artistic, trendy map from the 1930s, but it shows the hospitals, it shows the vaccinations, it shows the schools, it shows the railways which the French brought to the Vietnamese. Now, much ink has been spilled, as you well know, on the question of what is modernity? What is the modern? For many, modern simply means recent, not old. I agree. The 19th and 20th centuries usually do the deal. Most histories of modern China, modern the US, it's the 19th and 20th centuries. For others, maybe modernity refers to a very Western historical transformation which culminated first in Europe and in North America in the 19th century, maybe a little bit before, with the advent of industrialization, with the advent of urbanization, scientific and bureaucratic rationalization, capitalism, and of course, the rise of the nation state. Now, according to this school of thought, capitalist-driven Western colonial expansion in the 19th and early 20th century exported all of these components to the non-Western world, to Africa and to Asia. The modern in the non-Western world thus begins with Western colonial contact, the point of impact, the point of awakening, as one French author put it in describing the contact between the British and the Chinese. The West arrives and the West transforms. Most histories of modern China, as I'm sure you know, begin with that magic date, 1842, the date at which the British defeated the Qing dynasty during the Opium Wars. It was only then, the story goes, that China embarked on the road to modernization, progress, and capitalist-minded industrialization and socioeconomic organization. Many specialists writing on Vietnam, and it was true for me until about 4 or 5 years ago, and I can explain to you perhaps why in the discussion, but almost, I would say all of those writing on modern Vietnam begin modern Vietnam with the point of Vietnam's colonial contact with the French attack in 1858. The problem, in my opinion, is that the periodization, the defining, and framing of all that is modern in Vietnam in such terms comes with real problems. First, it creates a great divide between the pre-French period, usually summed up in 20 pages, and all the rest, and then we get to the war. So it creates a great divide between a pre-colonial, pre-French past and a much more detailed 19th and 20th century, during which Vietnam becomes modern. Second problem, by assuming that modern Vietnam began with the French attack of 1858, we lose sight of the complex set of pre-existing historical factors and a plurality of pre-existing modernities that went into the making of modern Vietnam. So look here, you've got Du Mer, the bridges. The French build the famous railway that goes to China first and then links the country by going southward towards Saigon. But you have other type of modernities that existed before. Think of these examples. You have the merit-based Confucian examination system and the rational bureaucracies it nurtured. And these were essential components of modernity present in China, present in Korea, and present in Vietnam. I'm gonna have to get up again, I'm sorry. It's a picture from the colonial period. But don't forget that the Confucian examination system continued until 1919, 1920 in Vietnam. This captures this idea of a highly developed and literate society based on classical Chinese, which fed a very modern administrative system. An administrative system, despite the civil wars, but during the times of unity, created a centralized and rationally operating state. So rationally effective that the French grafted their administrative structures onto the pre-existing Vietnamese structures. Vietnam had the Confucian-based examination system and bureaucracy from the north to the south. It was weaker in the south. Nonetheless, the French figured out that we can't keep Vietnam unless we can control and use this remarkably modern administrative structure in order to maintain our own colonial rule. So you have this amazing photo where you have the Mandarins who are kowtowing to French colonial officials. I won't go into the details, but the French realized, because to be a good colonizer, you have to know how to graft what you want to do onto the pre-existing structures. You don't know the language, you don't know the country, you don't know the people. And so they grafted their bureaucratic rule, their colonial rule, onto this very modern and pre-existing system that you can see here. I give an example in my book. This is the Emperor Ming-Mang. He was the son of the man who unified Vietnam in 1802. I'm not going to give you too many names, but this is the son, Ming-Mang. He was a great modern state builder. He created a centralized state. He rejuvenated the bureaucratic system. Excuse me. He developed intelligence services. He developed all sorts of modern bureaucratic methods to better rule this remarkably varied and oftentimes unruly country. He would therefore use this bureaucratic system to create, in many ways, what may well have become a remarkably modern Vietnam had the French not intervened in 1858. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Ming-Mang could have achieved everything that he wanted to do. I don't think he could have done it. And I'm not saying either that European modernization didn't count. Believe me, it most certainly did, and I think you will see evidence of that in my book. But my point here is to suggest that modernity is not an all or nothing thing. It exists in multiple forms at different points in time and space, and it often builds upon pre-existing ones. Last example, Vietnam, as you know, is one of the biggest rice producers and rice exporters today. This was true already in the 19th century under Ming-Mang, and Ming-Mang tried to develop the rice trade in order to feed a very hungry China and other parts of a very hungry Southeast Asia. You have the development of a very sophisticated rice market in Vietnam. Once again, if you look at things carefully, the French didn't create anything in the rice marketing and in rice agriculture. They grafted onto it. Ceramics. This is something that the Chinese obviously developed and exported to the Indian Ocean. China ware. But the Vietnamese also developed ceramics, and they were trading this from the 15th century with the Indian Ocean world. Fast forward just a little bit in time, and in the book I try to show how Vietnamese communists, much like their Chinese counterparts, or much like the French, latched onto this pre-existing statecraft, latched onto the examination system, which the French never really totally got rid of. They latched onto a bureaucratic system based on the Mandarins as well that wasn't abolished. And they latched onto the centralization that it provided in order to build a communist state. There's a graph not only between the French colonial state and the pre-existing state, but I try to argue in my book as well that there's something of a strange graph as well between what the communists would introduce as state building in the 1950s and 1960s and their ability to graft it onto something pre-existing. This modern state, this rational bureaucratic state, also turned out to be highly effective in a time of war. And I try to show in my book, yes, the Vietnamese communists would graft on very Maoist type of techniques onto this pre-existing state, but the two often went together. And this is one reason. It doesn't explain everything, but I'm just trying to give you a few examples. This allowed the Vietnamese communists to mobilize between 1950 and 1954 1.7 million peasants as porters, those who supplied arms, food, rice to the soldiers, to the 7 divisions or 6 divisions that were moving around northern Vietnam, fighting the French between 1950 and 1954. And there's something to be said for this graft, which allowed the Vietnamese Communist Party to organize a modern set-piece battle at Dien Bien Phu, one that did defeat the French in that battle on the 7th of May, 1954. I'm saying that there's overlaps that we need to take into, that we need to consider when we talk about this question of modernity. Okay, I'll take up my last one here. This is a tricky theme. This theme you don't find in any history really of Vietnam. It's what I call colonial Vietnam, resistance and collaboration in the making of Vietnamese modern history. Vietnam is in many ways a colonial construction. First of all, it was part of the Chinese Empire for 1,000 years, and it matters. Vietnamese historians and Western historians opposed to French, American, and Chinese interventions in Vietnam in the 20th century don't like to talk about this question. They tend to focus, as I showed you at the beginning, on the theme of deep Vietnamese resistance to colonial rule in order to explain communist Vietnam's liberation struggles in the 20th century. There was resistance in Vietnamese history. I would never deny it. But we forget that for better or worse, empires have also served as motors for historical change. And this question of empires and historical change moves throughout my book. This is something that I stress. Why? Because empires connect, empires circulate people, they move ideas, they move cultures, and they move languages. Empires can be processes for technological, cultural, and economic change. Think about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire served as a vehicle through which institutions, laws, architecture, religions, and a Latin-based writing system spread into Gaul, or into French lands, if you like, or conquered French lands. 1,000 years of Chinese administrators introduced new notions of law, time, and space, as well as bureaucratic statecraft, weapons, paper, and a character-based writing system to Vietnam and Korea. Vietnam was the southernmost province of China from the 2nd century BC until the 10th century AD, about 1,000 years. The Vietnamese participated in the Chinese imperial state, even though nationalist historians worried about the Chinese in the present are loath to talk about this. But don't forget that for half a millennium, the Romans ruled what we call France today. And the Roman history is still a part of French history today. Now, let me be real clear on the next part, is that behind these transfers, behind these circulations stood force. Not all emperors were benevolent father figures, neither among the Romans, the Chinese, or the Vietnamese. Onerous labor requirements, heavy taxation, and corruption were sources of social discontent and revolt. And colonial culture, Chinese culture, and statecraft often collided with pre-existing political formations, cultures, identities, and languages. So I come back. This is not all fiction. The Vietnamese did indeed resist the Chinese Empire with the Chung sisters here, 1st century AD. You had another very famous heroine in the 4th, 5th century AD, Ba Chiu, the Dame Chiu. You have the resistance to the Chinese here in the middle, and of course you have the resistance of the last, in 1979 until 1991. So my book takes the Chinese seriously is what I'm saying. It takes the Chinese interaction seriously because they did count. Because they did introduce a new type of statecraft, a new type of economy. And had Vietnamese elites of all kinds not collaborated with the Chinese or found something that they needed in this empire, then it's hard to believe that the Chinese imperial moment in Vietnam could have lasted 1,000 years. Again, that's not an anti-nationalist remark, but it's an attempt to suggest that there are dangers in making the deep past fit the needs of the present of the Third Indochina War, or the present today with the problems with the Chinese in the South China Sea. This now brings me to the question, and the sticky question, of Vietnam's own imperial expansion. The Vietnamese gained their independence from China in the 10th century. They're independent in the Red River, Vietnam here until the 15th century. The Ming Dynasty comes back and tries to make Vietnam the province, the southernmost province, to trade with the Indian Ocean again. The Vietnamese resist, they push them back. But then something very interesting happens, and that is that the post-colonial leaders, once the Chinese are gone, become colonialists themselves. Right here, you have the Cham kingdoms. There was a series of them. They go all the way down to the south. And then the Khmer Empire, as I told you a moment ago, controlled the Mekong Delta. If you look at this map here, you have lords who are running after the 15th century, the Red River, Vietnam. There's a civil war between them, and the wind moves south. The wind moves south, and this is where they start building a separate Vietnam, but a separate Vietnam built on the conquest and colonization of the Cham people and of the Khmers in the Mekong Delta. My point here is that there was no S, but it's a process of colonization on the part of the Vietnamese, like the Chinese, which creates the S as they move southward towards the Mekong Delta. So you can see here how this S comes into being, and it's going to finally take on this form that you see here when the Vietnamese get to the south and when that civil war is over in 1802. That's how the S came into being. S is an imperial construction, which looks like the modern Vietnam that we know here. It didn't stop there. In the 1820s, and in particular in the 1830s and the early 1840s, Minh Mang, the ruler I told you about a moment ago, would push westward into Cambodia, establishing a protectorate and eventually direct colonization over Cambodia, westward into what's eastern Laos today, Cha Neng. And the Vietnamese, by the late 1830s, 1840s, say, had created a state which doesn't look like an S at all. What does it look like? It looks like French Indochina. I get back to my point is that the French didn't necessarily create everything kind of with the magic wave of the wand. This here is French Indochina, but it strangely resembles the Vietnam that existed in the 1840s. Don't forget that the French arrived in 1858. So the French, some people say that the French created Indochina. I would say that the French, and you can see it if you look closely, in order to claim territories in Cambodia, they relied on treaties that had been signed between the Vietnamese and the Cambodians, or documents which basically allowed the Vietnamese to take over. Same here. And so the French would attach these territories to their own colonial state, French Indochina, which formally came into being in 1887. So my point here is that much of the history of Vietnam after leaving the Chinese Empire in the 15th century is a colonial history their own. As you can imagine, this as part of a new history doesn't go down too well in Vietnam today in light of the relationships which the Vietnamese Communist Party still entertains with the Laos in particular, and with Hun Sen in Cambodia as well. And Hun Sen was trained by the Vietnamese. He did his PhD in Hanoi in the 1980s. But you can see that the question of colonial expansion, the idea that there existed a Viet Indochina before the French, is something which causes some problems today. Maybe 5 minutes? Yeah. This question of double colonization, I think, is an interesting one. The French grafted their state onto the pre-existing bureaucracy, as I said a moment ago. The French grafted the creation of French Indochina onto this pre-existing kind of Vietnamese Indochina. What is also interesting is the extent to which the French relied on the Vietnamese to help them build and run Indochina, French Indochina. There was resistance. These are dated from the 1930s. You have the creation of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party by Ho Chi Minh, which will occur during this time. But if you read what's going on here, you can see that many Vietnamese began to see in French Indochina the possibility of going Indo-Chinese themselves, or going back to the Vietnam which they felt that they had a right to, or they were on the verge of creating themselves. This here is a bureaucrat, Boi Quan Kieu. This here is what I would say is the Vietnamese capitalist in the 1930s, Pham Le Bon. I'll let you read what they say, but I think you can see the extent to which resistance is certainly a very important topic, but it can't be the only one, because you have these people who are working with the French thinking that they're going to turn French Indochina into something real. Let me just move on. Can I go ahead and move one forward? Okay. There was also a parallel interaction which occurred between Vietnamese nationalists and Vietnamese communists on the one hand, and the French colonial model on the other. And that's the creation of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. Don't forget that Ho Chi Minh created the Vietnamese Communist Party, but then he changed it to the Indo-Chinese Communist Party on orders from the Comintern. Why? Because all good revolutionaries had to fight, not for their nations, but for the colonial model. So in Indonesia, they were Indonesian communists, and in Indochina, they were Indo-Chinese communists. What's interesting is if you go ahead in time a little bit, you can see the extent to which Vietnamese communists were quite happy to adopt the Indo-Chinese model. This too is taboo in Vietnam, and I'm not looking for a fight, but I'm trying to show why it's interesting to look at these complexities here. So we get to the late 1940s and into the 1950s, and when the French start to create 3 associated states of Indochina, one for Bao Dai, one for Norodom Sihanouk, and one for the King Sisavabong in Laos, you have something very interesting that occurs, is that the Vietnamese, led by Ho Chi Minh, create counter Indo-Chinese states run in association with the Vietnamese, the Pathet Lao, the Khmer Rouge, and of course the Vietnamese themselves. States will be created in 1950. You have the creation of revolutionary states, or at least by 1954, which are present, or at least the Vietnamese wanted them to be present, at Geneva. The reason why Indochina's a complicated situation is because many have accused the Vietnamese of being imperialists themselves. I don't think they quite saw it that way. I think that they saw this as they had to fight together in order to get rid of the common enemy, the French, to get rid of the common enemy, the Americans, and to get rid of the common enemy, the Chinese. But this picture might be of interest to you. No. Ho Chi Minh, 1950s, with Prince Suphanawong. Of royal blood, of course, he's a prince who is going to cross over and collaborate with the Vietnamese for his own personal reasons. The Vietnamese are quite interested in winning over Suphanawong because he is of royal blood. It's a way of kind of winning over the support of the people they need in order to build their counter-revolution, their counter-states, colonial states. Here you have another Laotian leader. His name is Khai Son Phumewong, the son of a Lao mother and a Vietnamese father. His father was a bureaucrat. Both these men are fluent in Vietnamese. Suphanawong's wife is a Vietnamese. But my point here is I get back to earlier things that I was saying on empires, is that Ho Chi Minh needed these people who could help him create these Indo-Chinese revolutionary states that he wanted to make. The problem was they ran into someone who was against this. This is a very famous photo right here. This is a photo of Ho Chi Minh. He has a cigarette. It's going to be removed from some photos. But he's with Khai Son Phumewong in 1966. It's the meeting of the Indo-Chinese leaders, the revolutionary leaders. There's somebody who's been cropped out after. This is the original picture here. Can anybody tell me who this person might be?
Pol Pot.
It's Pol Pot. It's Pol Pot, who had to be, I mean, I think we agree, he had to be removed from the picture. I don't mean that in terms of an execution, I didn't mean that. He had to be cut out of the picture. And it's a friend of mine who's been living in Laos for the last 15 years. He found this picture. So the original picture is this one here from 1966. And we do know that Pol Pot was there. But of course, we know that Indochina poses a problem for the Vietnamese communists to this very day, because Pol Pot was obsessed with the idea that the Vietnamese wanted to create, resurrect, impose, and